as he was working through the location of the temple through Josephus, and that led him to re-examine Maccabees. And then he saw that there was a combining of the two to, as I said, the coherent story of what happened when, and the approval of everybody except the Essenes. And some of the writings of the Essenes also bear into the evidence that he developed.
Well, you can't just take a mountain and it disappear. Where did all the material of the mountain go?
Well, the material of the mountain was thrown into the Kidron Valley and on the other side in the Tyropoeon Valley. And these two valleys were then filled up while the mountaintop was literally shaved.
However, in those days when the Asmoneans reigned, they filled up that valley with earth and had a mind to join the upper city with the temple. Then they took off part of the height of the Acra and reduced it to be of less elevation than before, that the temple might be superior to it. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
You can still see even more evidence of how Mount Zion was removed by Simon. The entire southern portion of the southeast ridge was terraced downward, like stairs leading to what was left of the southern tip. Both First Maccabees and Flavius Josephus record how Simon the Hasmonean cut down and removed Mount Zion. In his grand scheme, he accomplished two things. No longer would foreign powers such as Syria be tempted to invade and seize the high ground of Mount Zion and David's citadel. Both had been removed. But the mountain itself would be used to fill up the Valley of the Cheesemongers to the west, thus connecting the southeast ridge with the western hill. Jerusalem would expand and grow westward. But with the excavated remains of Mount Zion having filled the Trophonian, or Valley of the Cheesemongers, and Mount Zion having vanished from sight and from history, the name of Mount Zion was transferred to the Western Hill, and the Western Hill became known as Mount Zion itself, and so it is to this very day.
This Zion Gate really has no relationship to Mount Zion at all. Simon had chopped down Mount Zion, cut it down completely to the bedrock, and that completely changed the geology of the entire area. And so that this has no relationship to Mount Zion. Mount Zion was over there, not here, but when Mount Zion was cut down, the city expanded to the west, and that became encircled. This may be a legitimate gate, but it's not the southwestern gate of Jerusalem. It might be the northwestern gate of Jerusalem.
Well, you can see the Wailing Wall off in the distance, and I want to give you kind of a perspective on this Trophonian Valley, or the Valley of the Cheesemongers. It kind of came down this road, and you can see kind of how it's ramped down. This is still all fill dirt here, and it went down, 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 down through this dung gate here, which of course the valley was wider, but this just gives you a perspective on where this Trophonian Valley went. We're going to go down a little farther, and there's a road right down there where you see that truck going down. That's how that Trophonian Valley fell down to the west side of the city of David. So the Trophonian Valley went southward this way. The city of David's over here, and it was pretty deep. It was as deep, most likely, as the Kidron Valley. But this valley went down this way, and you can see how this street falls off here, and this is where the Trophonian Valley went. The city of David's off to my left here, but you can see how it fell off. This is all fill dirt. It came from the Mount Zion that Simon cut down and filled in this area connecting the western side. There's the western hill over there, and the southeast ridge is over here. But this is the route that the Trophonian Valley went, and then it kind of circled to the left and then connected in with the Kidron Valley south of the city of David. Now, as you look off to my right here, the city of David was over this way, and it was much higher. That's the hard part, because most people, they don't give it much thought, because the whole city was cut down by Simon. He lowered the Ophel, and he totally cut down Mount Zion, and it's gone. There was a mountain down there, but it's no more. And that's why it's so hard to understand the topography of Jerusalem unless you understand the history and the writings and what has been witnessed in history by other people that came to this area. But that's the area of the city of David. That's where the temple was, down in that area. And so we're going to go to another perspective. And so it's really hard to visualize what Jerusalem was like today, 3,000 years later.
Right, and it's a geological problem, because you have to reconceive of what the geology, all you have are the historical sources. But unless you go to the historical sources and read Maccabees, you don't have a clue as to what it was like back then.
No wonder it's so hard to figure out where the temple goes, because unless you know through the writings that there was a mountain down here, you have no idea what Jerusalem looked like or where the temple went. And so people think that it was up there on the Harem, or what they call today the Temple Mount.
Right. That area was not the highest point in Jerusalem in the time of Simon the Hasmonean.
That's right, because Josephus said there was a third hill.
Yes.
And it was lower than these two hills down here, the western Jerusalem and the southeast ridge that we're looking at. Wow, amazing.
Simon's activity was so radical that it is difficult for people to actually believe that it took place, except it's presented in a matter-of-fact manner. And it's presented as if, well, of course, and he had all the approval of the people. Now, what Dr. Martin gets into a little bit in his book was that the only people who objected to Simon doing this were the Essenes. And apparently they objected very strongly and called Simon the wicked priest.
We need to go to Qumran, because that's where they went to escape what they thought was an untenable situation here in Jerusalem. So let's go on over to Qumran and see where these people lived and where they fled to escape the evil king priest.
This is Qumran, the site of the Hermetic wilderness residence of the Orthodox sect of the Essenes. The sect had formerly resided in the city of David when Simon the Hasmonean was given unilateral authority to act as both king and priest. But what is the connection, the hidden connection, between the Essenes, Mount Zion, and the location of the Jewish temple? The fact of the matter is that the Essenes hated Simon the Hasmonean. They so disdained his decision to cut down Mount Zion and then to move the tomb of King David to the western hill that in protest they left Jerusalem for Qumran, building their headquarters here by the Dead Sea. Their famous Dead Sea Scrolls were written here, and the temple scroll found in one of these caves testifies of their contempt for Simon when they named him the evil priest king. The Essene story is a major forensic evidence in that it resurrects the memory of Mount Zion before Simon tore it down from the southeast ridge. The reality of its former existence is absolutely critical in determining the exact and precise location of the Jewish temples.
When you look at the Wailing Wall, it's easy to forget that the Wailing Wall that you see is only about 60 feet tall, but actually in total it's 109 feet. So what you see is only about maybe 60% of the entire height of the wall. A lot of it is under the ground, which means this place was a lot deeper in the first century. Unless you understand the topography of Jerusalem, you can really get faked out in trying to figure out where the Jewish temple of the Jews really stood. This area was filled in by dirt, by Simon when he cut down Mount Zion. He took the the dirt from Mount Zion and used it to fill in this Valley of the Cheesemonger, which was also called the Trophonian Valley. And so it's been leveled out. And unless you understand how the lay of the land was, it's really hard to come to grips with where the Jewish temple really stood. But if you were up on top, you would see that the Temple Mount area, or the harem, was trapezoidal. And so it kind of filtered down into a much tighter width when you get down to the city of David. In fact, it goes all the way down to the southern area of the city of David and almost forms a triangle. So this brings to mind something one of my friends, Michael Sanders, said to me when he said, you know, don't forget what Josephus said about the temple.
I have lots of stories. I've had an incredible life, right? I was the Forrest Gump in reality, you know. I've had the most wonderful of lives, tremendous background, had a lot of adventures, and none of it is valid. Either what I say is right or it's wrong. You see, the Wailing Wall and the Western Wall, there's always a controversy of somebody not liking it being called the Wailing Wall and people calling it the Western Wall. Many Jews believe that this is part of the temple itself. When they're pressed on it, when the archaeologists start talking, then, well, maybe it's the outer wall of the temple. The problem with all that, where it is that Josephus was very explicit, and he was there, about the dimensions of the temple and the dimensions of where the Haram now is. Josephus said quite clearly that the southern promenade of the temple was 600 feet long. Fair enough. But then he said, and it goes from valley to valley. And it couldn't be extended anymore because the valleys were there. The problem is that in the Haram, it's 900 feet. So you put a 600 feet structure on the Haram, it certainly doesn't go from valley to valley, and you could extend it another 300 feet. So either Josephus was lying, and what's the point of him lying, or it's in the wrong place. By chance, if you look at the drawing of the temple on my website, you will see that the city of David, from valley to valley, is exactly 600 feet. It's not a foot more and it's not a foot less. It happens to be the exact same size as Josephus described as the southern promenade of the temple. 600 feet, the width of the city of David from valley to valley, the Cheesemonger Valley to the Kidron Valley is 600 feet. At that point, just above where? The Gihon Spring, where you would expect it to be. Not further north of the Gihon Spring, not south of the Gihon Spring, exactly where the Gihon Spring is. That's where the temple was. That's where you would build a temple. That's where I would build a temple. That's where David and Solomon built a temple.
So this area was too big, but it wasn't too big for the 10th Legion. There were 6,000 men in the 10th Legion, and this 35-acre harem could have easily accommodated those men, as well as the 3,000 to 4,000 other people that had to support that 10th Legion. When you study the topography, you get a real sense of where the temple only could go and where it couldn't go. And for sure, because this harem is 900 feet across, it didn't go up here, it went south over the city of David.
I'm a hydrogeologist, work for the U.S. Geological Survey. My specialty is underground water, and I've studied groundwater systems all over the United States and all over the world. And I found one of the fascinating places that I've looked into groundwater is actually in Jerusalem at the Gihon Spring. And the Gihon Spring is very fascinating because it's a spring in a karst system, and there are thousands of karst springs all over the world. But the Gihon Spring is an unusual type of spring, a very rare type of karst spring that we often call a siphon spring. And there's probably only maybe a dozen or so of these springs all over the world. And the Gihon Spring is one of them. And so how these siphon springs operate is that somewhere uphill of the spring there'll be a cavern. And this cavern naturally, slowly replenishes as groundwater fills the cavern. But connecting the cavern and the spring, there'll be a channel. And the channel won't be straight, otherwise, as the water naturally filled the cavern, it would just continually flow out of the spring. But what happens in these rare siphon springs is this channel will be in the shape of an upside down U. So there'll be a high point. So as that cavern starts to fill naturally with water, with groundwater, very slowly, there's nowhere for it to run out. And as the cavern fills, that channel fills, until the cavern reaches, the water level in the cavern reaches the high point on that upside down U. And once that happens, then the water starts to flow and it creates a siphon effect. So it's just like if you siphon gasoline out of your gas tank and you've got a hose that's coming out of your gas tank. And once you get that gasoline flowing, as long as the end of that hose is below that water level, that gasoline is going to continue to come out of your tank until that level comes below the end of your hose, and then the air will get in and stop. So the same thing happens naturally underground in a siphon spring. That cavern will start to empty until either the water level in the cavern reaches the level of the spring, or the water level completely drains the cavern and air can enter that channel either from the cavern or from the spring. And once that happens, the siphon is broken and the flow stops. So when the flow is flowing very strongly from the spring, that's when the cavern is emptying. And then when the siphon breaks, then the flow rate slows back down to a trickle. So the question some people ask is, could the water level have naturally gotten up to the level of the temple? And the answer to that question is, it depends on where the water level is in the cavern relative to the elevation at the temple. So we know from the fact that this is a siphon spring that there in fact was somewhere uphill a cavern that was filling with water. Now if the Gihon Spring was not a siphon spring, we wouldn't know that. The water level could simply be only a few feet above the spring somewhere, but because it's a siphon spring, we know there's a cavern somewhere uphill, probably at some substantial elevation above the spring. So if I wanted to have that water come all the way up to the temple, it's sort of like I want in my gas tank, my hose, I want the gasoline to come out higher. You would simply raise the hose up higher to get the gasoline to come out of your hose higher. But you can't raise it above the level in the tank. So if we go back to the temple, and if I wanted the water at the spring to get up to the temple, if I blocked off the spring and made it watertight, and there was a vertical shaft, then the water level would continue to raise in that shaft until it either reached the water level in the cavern or reached the temple. And if the temple is lower than the cavern, then the water will naturally flow out at the site of the temple.
North of the Kidron Valley is Mount Scopus, the probable location of the cavern. In the opposite direction, looking south from Mount Scopus, there is more than sufficient drop-off for the water to gather speed and momentum, generating tremendous water pressure. The combined siphon effect, along with the water pressure when it reached the southeast ridge below, created an upward thrusting of the water, much like the activity of Old Faithful. All that was needed to channel the water to the temple above was for the spring to be blocked off and a vertical shaft allowing the water an upward route from the spring below. In 1867, Sir Charles Warren, a British archaeologist, discovered such a vertical channel at the Gihon Spring. This unique water system brought a massive volume of water to the temple above, absolutely critical for the enormous and daily needs of the Levitical priesthood.
Jerusalem 3,000 years ago had nothing to commend it. Nothing. There was nothing there. There's rocks, there's mountains, there's hillsides. It is a terrible place to be. Why would you settle there? For one reason: there is fresh water. There's a spring. The spring is by what we now call the City of David. It is nowhere near the Haram where it is claimed that the temples were built. That's number one. Number two, in all the Jewish writings, it is claimed that the temple needs vast amounts of water. If you need vast amounts of water, you would tend to build the temple near the water, not hundreds and hundreds of yards away from the water, especially when this is not Roman times where they knew how to build aqueducts. This was 2,000 years before the Romans, when the ability to move water was impossible. So if you found a city near water, you build a temple near water. The only place to build it is where there is water, and the only place there is water is the Gihon Spring. There is no other source of water that can sustain any sort of community except the Gihon Spring.
Well, David, I think when King David looked out over this Kidron Valley and the southeast ridge and was looking at the city of the Jebusites, he was, I think, impressed and amazed at the amount of water coming out of the Gihon Springs and how formidable the city would be to conquer.
Well, water is life, and the Gihon is the only source of water within a 5-mile radius of this site. And you had to protect that. You had to build bulwarks. And the Jebusites had already done that. The problem was how to dispossess and get the Jebusites out of that water source so that it could then be the city of David and supply water both for the city and for the temple, which David probably had in his mind even back then.
But there was more to it than just the abundant water supply, and I think Josephus alludes to it in his writings.
Well, yes. Josephus says that the southeast ridge was protected by deep, deep valleys and made it impossible for this area to be attacked.
But these hills are surrounded by deep valleys, and by reason of the precipices belonging on both sides, they are everywhere unpassable. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
This southeast ridge is like a natural fortress with its own water supply, and David would have seen this immediately. And that's why he coveted this area for his city and location for the Jewish temple.
I remember reading clearly that Dr. Martin pulled from a lot of sources, although he primarily used Josephus. Who were the other witnesses that he drew from history that could give us testimony about what this place looked like way back when?
Well, the other key witnesses were Aristeas from the late 3rd century, early 2nd century. And he was an eyewitness. He was a pilgrim from Egypt, and he came and walked this area. The other was the Roman historian Tacitus, who obviously worked from written records that were available at the time. But the most important source, of course, is 2 Samuel chapter 5, which tells us this area, is the importance of this area.
And didn't the Jebusites, I remember that scripture, didn't the Jebusites actually mock David?
Yeah, they said that the blind and the lame could protect this city. It wasn't even necessary for strong men to defend this city. That's how strong the fortifications were.
Well, how did David manage to conquer Jebus?
Well, his associate, Joab, which was a relative of his, got up into the city with a group of men led by Joab, and they went up one of the water shafts in between the time of the propulsion of the water.
And by chance, strategically, the city of David now, but the Jebusite city, is very strategically placed. There are ravines around three sides. You can protect the southern side with a little fortress. You can protect the northern entrance, which is open, by a northern fortress. And nobody can get in. Nobody. So it's a very well protected, strategic community which has water. That's why the Jebusites were there. That's why David wanted it. And it's a good place to build a city. And as a PS, if you have a God that you want to worship, you would build him a house right in the center of that city. The last place on earth that you would build a house for your God is way in the suburbs where nobody can protect it and where it's open to any sort of invader. The reason of going to the city of David is that you could protect it. Why then would you build something outside the city that you can no longer protect? Makes no sense.
You know, David, there's one last thing I've got to talk about, because to me, it's the creme de la creme of all that Josephus said in his writings in the Wars of the Jews. It's the cherry on top of the ice cream sundae. He said that the temple was built on a crescent-shaped ridge.
But the other hill, called the Acra, and sustains the lower city, is of the shape of a moon when she is horned. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
That's where the temple was. And you know what? We have evidence of that crescent-shaped ridge from satellite photos. Even though Simon tore down the Mount Zion and affected the whole area of the city of David, you can still see that ridge from a satellite photo.
Yes, Ken, and it's visible even from the ground. The crescent is still there for anybody to see. You can see it from the north, you can see it from the south, you can even see it from the east. Josephus was a reliable witness. He was an eyewitness at the time. And what he talks about is still there today.
Now, if you took just 3 of the statements of Flavius Josephus, you would have a perfect historic vector of right where the temple was, a pinpointed location of it. Josephus said that the temple stood on a ridge and stretched from valley to valley. That would be from the Kidron Valley over to the Valley of the Cheesemongers, or the Tryphonian Valley. That's one vector. Number 2, he said that the temple was built over this gushing water system. That's the Gihon Springs, and that area was surrounded and protected by deep valleys and cliffs. And we've seen that. 3rd, he said that it would be built on a crescent-shaped ridge. Those 3 vectors pinpoint the exact location of the temple.
And Ken, you do realize what you're saying and the implications of it. Our location right now would be at the corner of the northeast portion of the temple, down the ridge, down the crescent.
But the greatest eyewitness of the facts came from Jesus. With great sadness, he stood on this mountain and prophesied that the glorious city Jerusalem would be completely destroyed. And then he said a long period of desolation would follow. He called that long period of desolation the times of the Gentiles. And Jerusalem will be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. By this statement, he also indicated there would come a fulfillment and an end to the times of the Gentiles. But today, Jerusalem is still trodden down, a divided city occupied with Muslims, Christians, Armenians, and all kinds of religious groups. And the Jews are still without their temple. And so the prophecy of the times of the Gentiles being fulfilled has not come to pass. But the glory of Jerusalem will once again return, and the times of the Gentiles will come to an end once the temple is rebuilt. But obviously, until the Jews come to the conclusion of just where their temple belongs, well, we're just going to have to wait.